Hi, I'm Beth, and today I'll be showing you how to put together a new shirt sewing pattern for the Smart Doll guys that I've created. The design for this shirt has been inspired by a 3D otome game called Love and DeepSpace. I'm not normally a mobile gamer, but I really got into this game, and I loved the designs of the characters' clothing. Not all of them will translate into real-life clothing, but in particular, I like the asymmetric design of Rafayel's shirt pictured here. Thanks to the design's asymmetry and the pin tuck or plain options, I really think you're going to find this sewing pattern incredibly versatile. You'll be able to mix and match each side and variant of the shirt to create literally hundreds of unique options. I have digitized the pattern, so it's available to download as a PDF printable pattern. You'll find it available now at bethramsden.com. There will be a link in the description box below if you want to try it out yourself. Once printed out at 100% scale, you'll want to double check your measurements against the ruler on the pattern, and if everything's fine, you can cut out all of your paper templates. For the front piece here, I cut out the dart like this. Once all of your pieces are cut out, I recommend for any pieces marked ×2, flipping over and transferring any markings like alignment markers or front and back, front center, anything you'll need to copy over onto the reversed or mirrored piece. Also consider copying over the front center marking for these two pieces, as well as an up arrow, just in case you get this muddled up. I've made a few prototype versions of this shirt already, the first of which had this pressed but otherwise openable kind of pleat, which, although it matches the look of the game the best, when put onto the doll it was difficult to get it to sit nicely all the time, and I fear moving the doll around would only cause these to open out and look bad. The next version of the shirt had slightly different cuffs, and also had ironed but also top-stitched pleats so that they wouldn't open out like the first ones. The next version of the shirt had no pin tucks and resolved a few sizing adjustments that I wanted to make. I also experimented with sewing a real button and buttonhole in the front, and was amazed that I could create one so small and functional too. This is the type of button I usually use with Blythe dolls. I added snap fastenings and also decorative buttons to the ends of the cuffs as well. Fabric-wise, for this project, I recommend a simple cotton, especially if you're doing the pin tuck version. It wants to take a press very well. During construction of my prototypes, I used this iron-on interfacing tape to help stabilize the pin tucks as I worked with them. I also made this pleating board out of lightweight cardboard, simply measuring and folding cardboard. And I used it like this along with my lovely Morrison's More card, tucking in the fabric, holding each previous pleat in place, just carefully pressing in each layer before taking the iron with no steam, of course, and pressing it well, letting it cool down using a clapperboard to get nice crisp pleats without any need to manually measure. For laying out the pattern pieces onto the fabric, I've actually marked out the grain lines on the pattern, so make sure the collar is on the bias. We'll need 2 of the cuff pieces, 1 of the upper back, and 2 sleeves, being careful to mark front and back because it's not symmetrical. I recommend tracing round your template pieces onto the wrong side of your fabric, in which case the facing piece for both the left and right sides of the shirt should be traced with text side up. If you're making the shirt without pin tucks, flip over the left and right front pieces before tracing. If you are doing pin tucks, set these 3 pieces aside for the moment, as they will need larger pieces of fabric. In either case, flip the upper left front piece over before tracing too. Our first pieces are cut out, and for the 2 facing pieces, you'll need to overlock the upper and side edges as marked on the pattern. The sleeves should be overlocked at the bottom at each side, a little beyond each of these markings. For the collar, cut on the bias, I've transferred markings only onto one part and just cut the underside roughly to match. I've copied the seam markings over and extended them where I'm going to be sewing. For the pieces of the shirt to receive pin tucks, we'll cut out just rectangles of the fabric before refining the shape. Marked in pencil on each piece were my estimate sizes before digitizing the pattern, but on screen I'll mark the sizes that I plan to use next time for the rectangles. My fabric is roughly cut, and to have my pleats right side up on the doll's left, I'll orient my template this way, drawing on the fabric's right side. Leaving a little breathing room around the template, I mark the position of the first pleat. I'd mark it in with a heat erasable pen, and using my ruler, which has 7mm increments, a 1/4 inch at one end, I'm going to mark a series of lines, all spaced a 1/4 inch away from each other, this being the depth of my pleats. If you want to just manually position your pleats, you could do so by hand and add pins to hold them in place until you can press them all in with the iron. However, I'm going to try machine stitching each of my pin tucks, so I'm going to fold along the first pleat line and then at the machine sew along the next line to create a raised pleat that I'll press down afterwards. I will continue to add more parallel lines for the rest of the pleats. Here you see I've stitched my first one and added some more lines. I'm going to press it towards the right, away from the doll's centre front. And to mark the next pleat to be stitched, I fold along the line and, checking front and back to make sure I've got them lined up properly, I'll pin through the pleat until I can get it stitched. Here I have all 4 pleats for this piece stitched into place, and with an iron I'm going to carefully press them all in the same direction. Then I can align the template using the pleats as a visual guide, draw around them with my pen and cut out. Very nice. And stitching them this way, they're not going to pull open and they still look a lot like my reference material. I can repeat the same technique for the right front side, with the pleats heading the other way this time. The pleats are also at a slight angle, but just keep all your parallel lines at the same angle and it should be fine. Once all 4 are stitched, again I'm going to press them and then use my template as a visual guide to draw around and cut out the piece. When it comes to the dart, I copy it onto the fabric, but when cutting, I'm not cutting into the dart, but skimming across it. When it comes to the back piece, the pleats are going to be folding out away from a centre line, so that's where I start. Marking my parallel lines, here I've marked where each pleat is going to be folded with the pins, and each one, much the same, is going to be stitched one at a time at the machine. Here they're all stitched, and I'm not sure I like the visible row of stitching right down the centre. You could unpick this if you wanted to, but it looks a lot better once pressed. Next, I'm going to sew the dart in this piece. Although I traced it on the wrong side at first, I just copy the markings to the back pin and machine stitch. I press it with the iron with the seam allowance folded down. Next, I'll stitch the collar following this line first, then trim away the seam allowance before turning through, trimming the bottom seam neatly to match the first one, and then overlocking this lower raw edge, both pieces together. Next, I'll join together the upper and lower left shirt pieces, making sure the lower is the right way up with both front centres in the same line. With right sides together, pin them together and sew, overlock the seam, press it upwards, and then top stitch a couple millimetres away from the join on the upper side. And in the same way, we'll join the two back pieces, making sure the lower is facing up the right way. And with right sides together, align the center and each edge and pin, and then machine stitch. Overlock the seam allowance, pressing it upwards, and then top stitch. With the fronts and back all joined together, we can now line them up right sides together and join them at the shoulder seams. Once stitched, overlock the seam allowances and press them towards the back. Top stitch as well. Next, we'll take on the sleeves, making sure that our fronts and backs are aligned together with the cuffs. I haven't overlocked the sides of my sleeves yet, but I'm also going to stitch 2 parallel rows of long gathering stitches at the end of each sleeve. I transferred a few more markings to the cuff for clarity, but essentially we'll be tucking into the wrong side the seam allowance of each side of the sleeve hem, and we'll be gathering it to fit between these 2 markings. Here you see the sides are overlocked and tucked in and have the 2 rows of gathering stitches. I pull on the bobbin threads to gather until they match the distance needed on the cuff. I'll then align the right side of the cuff and the right side of the sleeve, making sure the front end of the cuff extends beyond the edge of the sleeve. I'll pin each side into place and then redistribute the gathers and pin them so I'm happy with it before taking it to the machine and stitching. Here that seam is stitched, and I'm going to lay it down and finger press it before folding the cuff back along its center line, and then tucking the seam allowance of the other side of the cuff up against itself. It should create a W shape from the side. I'll then stitch along these 2 seams, which should leave one end of the cuff extending beyond the edge of the sleeve. I then trim away the excess seam allowance and turn the cuff right side out using a pointy but rounded tool to push out the corners. And it should look like this, with a nice turned in seam on the inside of the cuff. I pin it in place for now, but will press it with the iron and will hand stitch the inner hem into place. I use a ladder stitch to close up the protruding end of the cuff with tiny stitches on each side just to close it in neatly. Then, for the rest of the cuff, I actually make use of the machine stitches from the other side of the cuff, and with the needle pick up one of the threads and then catch just a tiny bit of the inner cuff. And I repeat this again and again, making my way across the cuff, and this way you shouldn't be able to see any of my stitches from the right side of the garment. Here, both my cuffs have been pressed and hand stitched and are looking nice. And now they can be inset into the shirt. So I'm careful to make sure front matches front, and with right sides together, first align them at the shoulder point marked on the pattern, and then at either side of the sleeve, before adding lots more pins and stitching. I also make sure to cut lots of little snips just into the seam allowance of both the shirt and the sleeve before doing this too, so that everything can flex and not create any puckers. The sleeve is sized so that it shouldn't need to be gathered before inserting, but of course if you feel more comfortable doing that, you can. At the sewing machine, I'll sew with the sleeve side down, and once finished, I'll overlock the seam allowances together. With the iron, I'm going to press the seam allowance in towards the body, and on the inside of the shirt, I like to take a needle and thread and just add a little stitch right here, connecting the seam allowance of the sleeve to the seam allowance of the shoulder. Next we'll be inserting the collar, and again around the curves we're going to be cutting into the seam allowance with little snips. From the centre back I'm going to be pinning the collar in place and then overlaying the facings for the left and right sides. I've marked in the seam allowance onto the facings wrong side so they're nice and clear, and once all the pieces are pinned into place we'll be stitching them all in one continuous seam. The collar is pinned into place first. Next, I line up and pin into place the front edge of the facings. I'll redistribute these pins a little more sensibly in a moment. Here's a better view of what's going on. Starting at the edge of one facing, we're going to stitch all the way along and around, all the way to the other edge of the opposite facing. I cut snips into the curved seam allowances and trim off the corners. But before turning the facings round, I'm going to fold the garment in half, right sides in along the shoulders, to close in the side seams. I match and pin together the sleeves at the points marked on the pattern, as well as at the armpit and at the lower hem of the shirt, and then add more pins as needed before stitching from the mark on the pattern all the way down to the lower hem. Here you can see how the overlocked edging extends beyond the seam that I've just stitched, and in a moment I'll be overlocking and overlapping that slightly. First I cut snips into the curved armpit area and trim back the seam allowance as a whole just so it's a little neater, before overlocking all the way from here down to the bottom hem before I start turning out those facings. I turn the sleeves right side out as well while I'm at it. Next I'm going to need to finish this lower hem, so actually I'm going to turn the bottom side of the facings right side back in again until I've done it. I'm just going to overlock all the way from end to end. With the shirt's side seams facing in towards the back. With the iron, I'm going to turn up the seam allowance all the way along the bottom and press it. Here I've overlocked the edge, and I'm going to press into place that seam allowance before I turn the lower ends of the facings back to the inside. Here it's looking nice and neat, and I can now top stitch all the way across this bottom hem. Another thing I like to do with needle and thread is take the short end of these facings where they meet the shoulder seam, and with a whip stitch I'll sew the facing and the shoulder seam together just so they're held neatly in place. At this point, if you wish, you can also understitch just behind the collar. However, I think it looks nice and clean just as it is. I'm going to press and with another couple of hand stitches hold into place the little collar on the doll's right hand side here, and will then decide what my shirt's front closure will be. You could use Velcro, button and buttonholes, snap fastenings, anything you like really. I think the front of my shirt looks busy enough with the pleats that I'll probably go for a less visible closure. So while I procrastinate from the tedium of sewing in lots of snap fastenings, I add a couple more finishing touches, like my label sewn into the back at the collar, and also using a couple of my simple stuffed ironing shapes to nicely press the side and sleeve seams. They're just stuffed with toy filler, and I find them really useful to help press down some awkwardly placed seams. I also take the opportunity to try my shirt on my Smart Doll Guy, Jinshi. Oh yes, I think he looks very smart, don't you? Alright, I've put it off long enough. Time to sew in my snap fastenings. While I do that, let me just say a big thank you to all my lovely supporters over on Patreon, and also to welcome our two newest supporters, Ashley White and Ruth Bryant. My Patreon supporters will be getting this pattern for free, along with all the other patterns I've shared previously, and some exclusive videos, unboxings, and other content there. Check out the link in the description if you're interested. Well, as you can see, the shirt's all finished. It can be worn with the sleeves rolled up or snapped close with the overlapping cuff. I've stitched down the front collar, and I think it's looking really good. I honestly think there are hundreds of different ways you could put together this pattern, with the pleating or non-pleated versions, mix and matching both, having both left sides, having both right sides, all sorts of different ways that you could use this pattern. So I definitely hope you'll agree, and will check out the link in the description below to get the pattern for yourself. But wait, there's one more little detail to be added if my shirt is to properly resemble Rafayel's from the game. And that's the embroidery on the collar. I use a heat erasable pen to plan out the designs first, and then hand stitch them with a doubled over piece of embroidery thread. And that really does mark the end of this homage to Love and Deep Space, Rafayel's shirt, called White Sand Phantom. You'll find the pattern available at bethramsden.com, but before you go, I hope you'll leave me a like if you've enjoyed today's video, and also a comment. Let me know what you think of today's project. I've really been enjoying sewing for the Smart Doll Guys, and have loads more ideas that I have to get out of my head and into the world, so watch out for some more coming soon. Thank you all so much for watching today. Please take care of each other and yourselves, and I'll see you again soon. Bye!